With Nightcrawler once again possessing the fabled Hope Sword, he's now finally able to learn the real truth about who his parents truly are, and this revelation is going to change everything for Nightcrawler and Mystique forever. What is up, Earth's mightiest subscribers? It's Blerd without fear. Welcome back to the channel. Today's video, I'm going to be talking about X-Men Origins Blue #1, written by Cy Spurrier, with art by Wilton Santos, Marcus Toe, and Oren Jr., specifically in the inks department, and color by Cece De La Cruz. This issue is the thing I've been talking about since Uncanny Spider-Man was first brought onto the scene. This is an issue whose sole purpose is to recontextualize the origin story of Nightcrawler and Mystique and how they're related to one another. And this was something that was immediately said from jump to be revolutionary, that it was going to change the way you view the familial ties that Nightcrawler and Mystique have. And honestly, as I was going into this, I was like, I don't know how they're going to change this in any way that is going to make me think differently about these two characters. And I gotta admit, I was pleasantly surprised to find myself rethinking their entire dynamic. Now, for those who are unfamiliar, if for whatever reason this is your first time ever diving into the history or past of either Nightcrawler or Mystique, the thing you need to know is that it has long been hinted at and teased that Nightcrawler and Mystique are related. This is something that goes all the way back to 1981's Uncanny X-Men #142. In that issue, Nightcrawler witnesses Mystique briefly turn into him, and when all of this comes into play, she mentions that he's not as unique as he thinks, and if Nightcrawler wanted to know exactly why she looks so similar to him, that he should ask his mother, Margaly Zardos. Now, we would later learn that Margaly Zardos is not Nightcrawler's actual mother. She is only his adopted mother. But even back then, people started wondering, is she somehow Nightcrawler's sister, or maybe Nightcrawler's real mother? And over the years, this was something that was played with over and over and over again. And it would take about roughly just over 2 decades for us to get a legitimate answer to the question. And this came in the form of 2003's Uncanny X-Men #432. It was here where Nightcrawler's parentage was brought more into the limelight, where Kurt had finally learned that Mystique was in fact his actual birth mother. Once again, this is something that was always hinted at and teased at and danced around for the longest time. However, it wasn't until then where it was set in actual stone. And not only did we learn that Mystique was his mother, but also Azazel was his father. This explained the whole teleportation thing. And even though granted, a mutant being born from another mutant, they don't always have to have the exact same looks or even the exact same power. But at the time, it made the most sense. That was Azazel's whole thing. Teleportation, aside from being an actual demon. And that honestly was a satisfactory enough answer. And even back then, while it was kind of vaguely thrown out there that Mystique had, for all intents and purposes, thrown Nightcrawler off a cliff, it was something that she didn't really seem to have much in the way of any regret over. And unless that regret is not actually unaliving Nightcrawler as a baby. This made it so you wouldn't feel too much in the way of sympathy for a character like Mystique, who at the time had no redeeming qualities whatsoever and was just a straight up villain who every once in a blue moon you were reminded had human feelings. You fast forward to 2010's X-Men Origins Nightcrawler #1, and that gave you just a little bit more insight into how all this came into play, that it wasn't so much that she threw her kid off a cliff, it was the fact that she was trying to get away from a Bavarian mob that was trying to lynch her because she had given birth to Nightcrawler, who came out of the womb looking exactly then as he does today, as a little elf with blue fur and a prehensile tail. In that issue, we discovered that she did technically send Nightcrawler off a cliff, though it seemed like it was unwitting. She actually wanted Nightcrawler to find a safer home, setting him down a river, hoping that someone would find him and rescue him, while she stayed behind as the mob tried to attack. And it also was implied heavily that running away had exhausted her, so she also was not in her right mind when she did whatever she did, and thus she also passed out while all this was happening, and she really has no actual memory of it. And that has pretty much been the story since 2010. Now you fast forward to about roughly 13 years later, and now we know a whole other truth. The truth here is that in all of this, everything that we have ever known about Mystique and her familial relation to Nightcrawler, all of that has been kind of a lie. I don't actually want to use the term lie because that's almost too strong of a word for it. She is not the mother of Nightcrawler, at least not in the way that I'm talking about. She is not the birth mother of Nightcrawler. She is Nightcrawler's birth father. I know, right? Sounds kind of crazy, huh? We were of the belief that it was Azazel the whole time. Azazel is the one who was the pappy. That was supposed to be the whole thing. And as it turns out, it's not the case. While yes, Mystique did sleep with Azazel, there was no siring of any child. There was no conception to speak of. And as I was going through the story, I was wondering because they do at a couple of points kind of hint and tease that maybe Azazel was still in fact the father, but that's not actually the case. And if you're wondering how Mystique was able to do all this, the fact that she's a woman, she should not be able to sire a child in the way that a biological male would. The truth of the matter is, and this is something I've talked about in a previous video, go check it out up here, but Mystique's power is honestly probably one of the least defined mutant powers of any mutant who has been in the game, publication-wise, as long as Mystique has been. There are very few mutants whose powers have not been fully as explored as hers. It's funny to me too, because when you think about it, Cy Spurrier even gives us just a little bit of lip service in the form of a data page that basically explains away the whole thing. Mystique is not a shapeshifter. Mystique is a gene shifter. This is something, once again, as I talked about in the previous video for Uncanny Spider-Man number 4, I said that Mystique is able to change not only her appearance, but she's also able to change her genetics. She's able to change her hand to exactly mimic the unique palm print of any human she looks at. Any retinal pattern, she can mimic it. Any fingerprint, she can mimic it. Vocal cords, she can mimic those too. And not only that, she can do it with such lightning speed that even the greatest of supercomputers in existence, as Dr. Nemesis informs us, could not replicate what Mystique does as fast as she does. And before anyone starts coming out of the woodwork saying, well, wait a minute, does this mean that if Mystique can do this, she has literally changed the game? She's able to hide bazookas inside of her body and still maintain a fully functioning genetic structure that allows her to still live and breathe and not pass out and die. She can do all of these crazy things. Does this make her an Omega level mutant? No, it does not, because Mystique still has a limitation, something that Cy Spurrier kind of casually throws out there, stating through the words of Dr. Nemesis that her limitation is that she, at least as far as he knows, cannot replicate the X gene. Now, granted, he does leave the door open for someone to come in later and maybe mess around with that story if they see fit, but even going back to Mystique's earliest appearances in Marvel, she's never been able to replicate the powers of the people who she adopts the form of. She can adopt their appearance, but that's it. If she changed her appearance to look like Jean Grey, she would not have Jean Grey's telepathic or telekinetic abilities. Now, while we have seen her replicate the form of Wolverine and be able to replicate his claws, that is something that's a little bit different, because while technically you could make a case for that being a part of the X gene and thus why that door has been left open, it's also a part of Wolverine's appearance, and I would imagine if she can turn herself into a squid monster or an alien or a biological male in order to seed a biological female with a child, then I would imagine, making claws pop out of her hands is the least interesting thing she can do. And for those who are freaking out that, oh, she was able to turn to a biological male who actually has fully functioning sperm to seed a child inside of a woman, that's just a bridge too far. I'm gonna be honest with you. This is probably the least ridiculous thing we've ever seen Mystique do with her capabilities. Now, I've talked about her conceiving a child with a biological woman who was that biological woman who carried Nightcrawler to term. Well, I feel like this is actually the easy one, because who else would it have been except the love of Mystique's life, and that's Destiny. Destiny was the one who carried Nightcrawler to term. She is the one who gave birth to Nightcrawler in Bavaria. And none of that, honestly, is terribly surprising to me. As a matter of fact, That, I think, is actually the least surprising thing about this whole reveal. The stuff with Mystique, while definitely something I have always believed is well within her ability to do, it's something I never actually considered, but I was caught off guard by it, and I thought it was pretty cool. But yeah, the whole thing with Mystique and Destiny, it just makes sense, and it changes how you look at Nightcrawler going forward. Mystique basically duped Azazel into believing that Nightcrawler was his kid, and apparently this was all at the behest of Destiny, because she saw in the future that if Azazel was left unchecked, if he didn't have Nightcrawler in his life to deal with, he would have taken over the entire world and plunged it into complete and utter darkness and turmoil, thus pushing Mystique, edging her in his direction, because they had the type of relationship where if they ever felt themselves growing distant, they could go out and seek love elsewhere, so long as it was something that benefited them both. This was why Destiny pushed her in that direction. So with Azazel having a child with her, thinking that he had all of these other children that he had to deal with, including Nightcrawler, this would keep Azazel busy just enough that he didn't actually fulfill all of his wild machinations. Now, that being said, I feel like that part of the story is where, if you want to talk about jumping the shark, I feel like that's probably the one spot where it's like, okay, now you're being a little too extra here with this. But I get it. I totally get why they did it. Why? Because you have to clean it up. Why would Azazel, why would he be involved in all this, in the first place? So yeah, I don't envy Cy Spurrier's task with having to justify why Azazel was ever a part of this. That's neither here nor there. The point of the matter here is Nightcrawler has two moms. And, once again, it's something I find incredibly interesting here just because it doesn't really change how you look at Nightcrawler. It really actually changes more how you look at Mystique and Destiny, because with Nightcrawler being born, but also being sent down the river, being lost forever, we now know how Margulis Zardos ended up finding Nightcrawler in the first place. It wasn't luck or happenstance. This was all stuff Destiny had foreseen. It makes you rethink how you look at Destiny and Mystique more than anything else, and for no other reason that we learn later that this was all a calculated move by Destiny, and not only was this a calculated move by her, but also how Mystique and Destiny remember the whole thing, because we later learn that they went to Charles Xavier way back before all the craziness between them and the X-Men and all that stuff. They both went to Xavier and asked him to remove the memory of Nightcrawler. Destiny has no memory whatsoever about Nightcrawler not having given birth to him or him being lost. She's had all of it stricken from her mind by Xavier, because at the end of the day, the way she sees it, she gave up Nightcrawler for the greater good, sending him down that river, him falling into the hands of Margulis Zardos. This put him in the prime position possible to end up joining the X-Men down the road and being a thorn in the side of characters like Azazel, and also being a beacon for hope and light going forward. This was all in the effort of saving the world in her own way, preventing what is in her eyes the darkest timeline. And for her, that's a timeline where both herself and Mystique are not together. And in the case of Mystique, she didn't want to so much forget that she had a child, but she wanted to forget the nature of how she lost that child. Because as we go back to it in Bavaria, it wasn't so much that she sent her child down a river. She didn't do that at all. As a matter of fact, she set her child safely against a tree when she went back to try and save Destiny from the mob in Bavaria that was trying to kill them both. And when she came back, Destiny was nowhere to be found, and when she returned to the tree, Nightcrawler was nowhere to be found. The resentment and hatred that she feels towards Destiny for manipulating her in this way, that was what she had removed, and as Xavier warned them both, even with him removing their memories as well as purging it from his own mind, all of this was going to leave just enough of a hole in their memories that their mind would start filling in the gaps, and he warned them that those gaps could end up becoming worse than the truth they were trying to get rid of. This is basically a way to explain why Nightcrawler and Mystique's origin and how they're tied together has always been so muddy, and even also explains why Mystique has such resentment towards Nightcrawler. It was all a result of Xavier wiping her mind of how they became separated. She knew just enough to know that Nightcrawler was her son, but she didn't really know the nature of how it all came to be. Hence why we got all of those conflicting stories over the years, and now we have something that is a bit more definitive. I would actually dare say a lot more definitive. And with all of that, you would think this would make for some happy reunion. It kind of does, and it kind of doesn't, because Nightcrawler does reveal to Mystique in this issue who he really is, because this whole time, since Uncanny Spider-Man, he's never taken off his mask to reveal who he truly was to Mystique. The whole time they've been interacting with each other over the past 4 issues of Uncanny Spider-Man, Mystique has not seen his face. However, that doesn't really change the fact that she didn't know who he was. She did, in fact, know who she was, even though she does kind of imply that she knew but didn't know at the same time. It was something she suspected. So when he took his mask off, she was not surprised to find that her son was underneath it. All that said, though, I do appreciate the fact that while the reunion does not go, I think, as smoothly as it probably could have at first, I do appreciate that there does seem to be some level of reparation between the two of them, that they have finally embraced one another. They are embracing as mother and son in ways that I feel like we've never really legitimately truly seen before. They've always kind of kept a very cold relationship between one another, and here we're seeing them embrace in, I would say, a very heartfelt way. And also, speaking of heartfelt, I think would explain why when we get back to Uncanny Spider-Man number 5, where it's been revealed in the previous issue that Nightcrawler has been subdued by Silver Sable's mercenaries and handed over to Orcus, I think this actually lends more credence to the notion that Mystique is actually the one they have in their possession, not Nightcrawler. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video and you want to catch up with more of my coverage breaking down comics like the X-Men and other comics from Marvel and DC, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tap that notification bell so that way you don't miss anything. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and until next time, let me know what you thought about X-Men Blue Origins number 1. Keep it plus ultra and sound off in the comments.